To restore Azure SQL Active Directory authentication, start by understanding the key concepts involved. Azure SQL Database is a cloud-based relational database that supports Active Directory authentication, allowing users to connect to the database using their Azure Active Directory credentials. First, ensure you have the necessary permissions to manage Azure SQL Database and Azure Active Directory. You will need to be a member of the Azure AD Global Administrators Group or have the necessary permissions to manage Azure SQL Database. Next, identify the cause of the authentication issue. Common issues include expired or revoked Azure AD tokens, incorrect configuration of Azure AD authentication, or issues with the Azure AD tenant. To resolve the issue, start by checking the Azure AD tenant configuration. Ensure that the Azure AD tenant is configured correctly and that the necessary permissions are in place. Verify that the Azure AD application is registered and that the client ID and client secret are correct. Then, check the Azure SQL Database configuration. Ensure that Azure AD authentication is enabled and that the correct Azure AD tenant is selected. Verify that the Azure AD administrator is configured correctly and that the necessary permissions are in place. To restore Azure AD authentication, you can use the Azure Portal or Azure SQL Database Management Studio. In the Azure Portal, navigate to the Azure SQL Database Server and select Active Directory Admin. Then, select the Azure AD Administrator and enter the necessary credentials. In Azure SQL Database Management Studio, connect to the database using the Azure AD Administrator credentials. Then, execute the necessary T-SQL commands to enable Azure AD authentication and configure the Azure AD Administrator. Best practices for restoring Azure SQL Active Directory authentication include regularly reviewing and updating Azure AD configuration, monitoring Azure SQL Database for authentication issues, and testing Azure AD authentication regularly. By following these steps and best practices, you can restore Azure SQL Active Directory authentication and ensure secure and reliable access to your Azure SQL database. Remember to always follow security best practices when managing Azure SQL Database and Azure Active Directory.